Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the FuturePrint podcast. My name's Simon Daplyn. I'm the marketing manager at Sun Chemical, and I'm joined today by Jeff Freeman from Cimpress and Dominic Harris from CarbonQuota.
Hey, guys.
Today, we're going to talk a little bit about decarbonization. So recently in the news, it's been reported by the UK government is behind its targets on emissions. And really, there's a lot of misinformation in the market or misunderstanding in the market. And these two gentlemen have very kindly come to help us kind of decode that and see what we can all be doing in terms of decarbonisation. So welcome, gentlemen. Perhaps you can start by introducing yourselves for everybody.
Sure. Yeah. I'll go first. Yeah. So I'm Dominic Harris. I'm the CEO and co-founder at CarbonQuota. We're a specialist carbon measurement and technology company specifically for the print and packaging sector. So I think we can have an interesting conversation.
Excellent.
And Jeff Freeman, I lead the day-to-day sustainability function within the center of Cimpress. Cimpress is the parent company of a number of customer-facing brands that you may recognize, like Vistaprint from Auchendruck, TradePrint, Pens.com, and the list goes on.
Excellent. So I think a good place to start is to really talk about carbon itself and what that really means in relation to our topic. So Dom, maybe you could start us on what do we mean by carbon, and perhaps explain a little bit about the scope 1, 2, and 3 that we all hear about, but perhaps some of us don't know the full details behind.
Yeah, look, let's start with very simply, it's a complex subject, right? And we are the first to talk about that all day long, especially when you start talking to converters, you start talking to printers, you start talking to brands. It is a very technical, complex subject. Now, we try our best to actually make that less technical, but ultimately, carbon is the gas that gets emitted into the atmosphere, it's warming the planet, and it's created by every human activity. Whatever we do, 9 times out of 10, it creates emissions. And that fundamentally is a process that's warming the planet. So now I'm not a scientist by any way, shape or form.
That's good, none of us are.
But that's really good indeed, right? But ultimately, if you think about every time you open your fridge, every time you get in a car, every time you get on a plane, it creates emissions. Equally, within the print and packaging sector, is every time you make a plate, every time you process a plate, you buy some inks, every time you start the press, every time you buy some paper, every time you deliver something, all of that creates emissions. And sadly, our industry is a big emitter, right? We are part of the manufacturing world. Yeah, we manufacture stuff as we do. And that emits lots of emissions and needs to be controlled. And we come from the sector. I was born and bred in print and packaging, and actually that really helps to help demystify, to your question, help demystify what does a company do. So in broad terms, and in very short answer, they should measure, they should reduce, and they should measure again. It's really quite simple. When you say it like that, it's a lot more complex, by the way, when you actually have to do it. But measure, reduce, measure.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So coming to you, Jeff, in terms of Cimpress, obviously you explained it's a very big business globally, has lots of different facets within the business. How do you go about looking at decarbonisation, and what role does data play in kind of really guiding you towards the decisions that you're making?
Yep. So we've been at this basically 9 years now in terms of carbon accounting. I think our journey has been very similar to almost any company that starts. You start off measuring your scope 1 and 2, which is, I always describe as the emissions that are the result of the things happening within the 4 walls of your business, between your electricity usage and then some of your direct fuels. And then scope 3, which is all the other things. Dominic listed probably 10% of them, of all the other things that go into your overall carbon profile. But we followed a very similar path where we did scope 1 and 2, then we expanded to a spend-based accounting approach for scope 3, just to get a general sense of how big that carbon nut really was. And turned out to be a big number. And that 98, 97% of it is in our scope 3. And so we kind of went through that process of saying, okay, now we know ballpark how big our emissions are. Now we don't want to just know how big they are, we want to figure out how to reduce, and that spend-based accounting is not useful in that regard. And so about 5 years ago, we started that process of starting to really narrow in, talking to our suppliers and trying to get supplier specific information. And I think we've been relatively successful in doing that, and definitely in some pockets more than others. And then where we can't get that, still trying to get more accurate, filling in the gaps with essentially different accounting methods like allocation method and weight-based calculations. I think one thing that we've done in the last couple years that has been a bit of a step change for us is continuing down that path I just described, but also really starting to narrow in on some pockets where we've got almost complete information, where we've got like 80% of the emission profiles of different providers. And then really saying, okay, if we can convince that final fifth provider, let's say, to get us the information that we need, now we have a really complete look into what the opportunities are to decarbonize. And we have found that to be successful. We've seen that sometimes that last company, the one that hasn't provided information yet, didn't realize that they were behind the rest of the market, and just that like kind of light bulb moment for them has been effective. And then also just having somebody be very clear, giving them a clear market signal that people actually do want this information. Somebody's gonna not only want it and ask for it, but then intends to use it. And then also actually giving them feedback on whether the information that they've been providing or that they put together in the past is actually helpful, because they've been operating a little bit in the dark on their side, making what is in some cases an educated guess about how it would get used. And we as the one with a net zero 2040 commitment at the end of the print supply chain, get to be the one who actually are trying to get that information to the customer. And so we've been able to be that feedback.
So that's interesting, because like many kind of industries and areas, like data, I guess, is everywhere.
Everything.
And there's, it's what data to use, like what's good data, what's bad data, how do you validate the data that you're using? So are there things that you specifically look for in terms of making sure that the data you're getting is accurate, or providing you with the right information, rather than just having data for the sake of data, or just for reporting rather than something that's actionable internally? Yeah,
for sure. So we have a number of what we call quality criteria that help us decide whether or not we are going to use the information that's provided to us. Some of it is simple as just like vintage, like how old is the information? There was a whole subset of people within the printing industry that did product carbon footprint work. I mean, at this point, I would have to say 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And then I think they were good actors, and they were predicting where the market was going. And then either nobody ever asked for it, or maybe somebody asked for it, but then didn't use it. So we're definitely looking at vintage, but then we're also looking at like, what's the standard to which it's been calculated? What's the boundaries that they're following? So in our case, we're always asking for cradle to our gate. And then also, like I said, like what standard to which it's been calculated. So
I think the data question, Simon, is twofold, actually. There's two types of data when it comes to creating an accurate carbon footprint. There's something called activity data, which is how long was it on press, what paper mill did it go through, how far did it travel? And that is actually equally quite challenging to get hold of. And that's called activity data. So at that point, it's nothing to do with carbon footprint. It's just how long was it on press for? You then need to convert it into carbon footprint data, okay, which is different. So, and they're called emission factors. And I'm going to get slightly nerdy for a moment.
Go for it.
But ultimately, if you know a printing press is running for 32 minutes in Texas, and you know the energy mix of that factory, as an example, you can very accurately create the carbon footprint of the energy used. Okay, now, but the prerequisite of that being successful is you need two things. You need strong activity data. I know it was on press for 30 minutes, but you also need to use the right emission factor. And that's to Jeff's point, that there are many databases in the industry where you buy emission factors. We spend hundreds of thousands a year on buying emission factors, and then there are free ones. Now, there has to be a difference between the two, right? There is free data available, and there is the other end of the spectrum, a specialist company spending an enormous amount of money on high quality data. And the difference is enormous, humongous difference.
Absolutely.
So that question around data is twofold. It's how you know what goes into the product or the factory or the building, and then how do you convert it into a proper environmental carbon footprint. You have to look at both sides of that story.
So clearly Cimpress has been doing this for a while, 9 years, and revolving and re-looking at scope. But have you got any other examples of where CarbonQuota kind of encounters companies in the market? Don't need to give any names, but maybe people have been on a long journey and you're supporting them, or people that are really coming to it now and needing to know how to start the process of looking at their carbon.
Yeah, look, and interesting enough, you said 8 years, CarbonQuota has been going 7 years. So you've been actually working in this area longer than we've had the business. So, because it is a relatively new market, right? It's a new thing, 7, 8, 10 years is not an old marketplace, it's a young marketplace. And lots of businesses started, as Jeff did, is financial-led accounting. And that is in effect saying, we have spent $1 million on this material, and then you use a certain type of emission factor to convert it to a carbon footprint. Now, the problem with that, and that's why it's not in vogue, people don't do it anymore, and you're right to move away from that, that whole methodology, is that $1 million worth of paper 5 years ago is probably $2 million worth of paper today. So you have this fluctuation in price, and imagine what that does in your carbon footprint. Now, yes, you can adjust. I know there's some ways of adjusting this stuff, but ultimately it's not a very robust way of carbon footprinting. So, and we've got hundreds of customers, right? And they are different levels of where they're starting or where they want to end. Through, the smallest print company, the smallest converter, we may start doing some financial-led studies because that's all their budget allows them. And that's a really important point here, is that our industry has to assign budget to do things in the best way. But that's not reality. If you're a small printer under the arches and you want to start your journey by using a fairly simplistic way of measuring. But actually don't stop there, don't continue that, evolve the way you kind of build and the way you measure. And I think marketplace interesting, and I think that if you look at the UK versus Europe, I think Europe had a head start, and I think the UK always lags behind. And I know we're sat in London, right? I understand that, but that's partly because we had something called Brexit. That hasn't helped. There are some law issues that are happening, but then actually we start looking at different marketplaces. Canada's obviously very advanced, and the US is advanced as well. The US, we'll probably talk about this a bit more later, but the US is going at an absolute rate of knots right now. And I would say that it's overtaken Europe.
Okay.
From a sustainability point of view.
So if we expand that, one thing that I was interested in is the regionality of it. So for a company like Cimpress that has a global footprint, are you then influenced by what European law or reporting structures govern versus North America versus Asia? Is there things that you need to look at differently depending on the regionality of the product you're selling?
So I think we have the blessing of us deciding almost in advance of the regulations that come out what we want to do directionally. And so, as I said, there was no regulation that forced us to do some of the early carbon footprint work that we did, some of the work we've been doing around forestry. And then when regulation like EUDR comes into play in Europe, we're not having a conversation about like, oh, do we have to switch from this source to this source because of EUDR concerns? It really becomes a paperwork exercise. Same thing with carbon, where there's the regulations that are coming out. There's disclosure regulations in California that actually we are not covered under, and there's going to be CSRD in Europe. We'll have to do some reporting, but those don't actually drive a lot of the action for us. I think my general take on the regulatory environment is that there's been a lot of regulation, and then there's been some pullback on regulation recently. And I feel like the pullback has been on disclosure regulation, not on product regulation. And so all the product stuff, there's been some delays on the product stuff, but it's still happening.
Right.
And so all that work, all the calculations that you need to do around, product carbon footprints and all that kind of stuff, still is there. Companies are still having to move quite quickly.
I share that view, actually. I think my hypothesis on the same subject is that regulation is always coming. especially if you look from an EU point of view, it's always coming soon. If you look at EUDR as the greatest example, it's coming, it got delayed, it's coming, it's got delayed, and it just keeps, and it goes through that cycle, which is very frustrating. I can see it in our customer base, and Jeff, I'm sure you'll say the same thing, is that you prepare for regulation as a company, and then the regulation doesn't quite happen. So you get given another 12 months to prepare. And that's obviously quite a difficult thing for most businesses. Jeff seems like he's very advanced in that. But ultimately, I think it depends what you're producing. As a manufacturer, if you are in consumer packaging, it's a slightly different focus to commercial print for wanting, you know, if you make those two comparisons. So if you produce consumer packaging, the stuff we see in our cupboards, you're doing that for the Procters and Gambles and, you know, the Nestle's and the Kraft Heinz, and they have much more stringent environmental, you know, processes about their supply chain, because they're producing things en masse, and they're producing things for everybody around the world. So that's quite a unique kind of flavor to that business. So therefore, those mega brands ignore regulation and they just adopt the same principles Jeff does. Just get ahead of the curve. Let's get it right. Have one global standard. So there, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. And what I see when I talk to what I call the mega brands, the Nestle's and the P&G's, what they do is they set their bar to the most stringent market, which is probably California right now, if I had to guess that. I would say it's California right now, which you would never ever think that, right? How would you ever suggest, 12 months ago that California was going to be the most stringent market when it comes to, environmental measures? But then on the print side, it's also when you segment the market down again, and you have to, is that a business card doesn't really matter because it's only 16 grams of CO2e. It's so small, that's not where your focus should be. I agree you should measure, but actually when you look at events, which is still print, and you're doing pop-up banners or display in Reboard or whatever it might be, that really matters because the carbon footprint is probably 30,000 tons of CO2e. Do you see? So you have to have materiality sort of point of view when you look at where people focus. So that's not a criticism. A business that prints business cards actually prints hundreds of thousands of business cards a day. Okay, so therefore it is material. But if you look at it through the lens of one business card, it doesn't matter. And the same arguments with ink, actually, same argument, and this is really important to me, is that if you look at ink impact on one job, the carbon footprint associated to the ink that's just used and that one job is just negligible. But if you are a big ink manufacturer, if you've got factories all around the world, you've got to attack it because you're having a big impact.
Yeah.
So it's just a slightly complex, nuanced answer, I'm afraid.
No,
straightforward.
That's great. And so we obviously got influence of regulation, influence of regional government, influence of brand with their brand purposes. Do you see any influence of consumer? Is there are we at a point where the consumer cares about the product carbon footprint of what they're buying yet? Is that to come? Is that not influencing decisions that you're taking?
Yep. So I think there will always be a portion of the customer base that is influenced by that. I think even today, that group of customers, even if they want to make decisions based on that, will have difficulty doing so. And in some cases might make some assumptions along the way. So for example, a very common assumption in the print industry is that closer is always better. When you have significant data capabilities and you've done that sort of analysis, you begin to realize that that's sometimes the case, but definitely not always the case.
Right.
And so I think the consumer is at a point right now, because of where the general industry is right now, is that the portion that would want to make decisions based on that couldn't if they wanted to, or it would be an incredible amount of work. But where I do think it gets interesting is with, it was mentioned on a previous panel, AI and AI shopping, where now people can start to, their AI of choice gets to know them, what's important to them, starts to prompt them to say, hey, for this purchase, are you interested in this environmental attribute or that environmental attribute? And all of a sudden, at least the workload goes down for a consumer that's interested, if not still the ability to access the information.
I guess it's about making a conscious decision, right? If you book a flight now, most airlines will tell you the carbon emission or the carbon impact of the flight you're taking, right? And so do you see that, Dominic, as part of your work, that would be being able to communicate that specific fact, bit of data to the consumer so that it's kind of manageable for them, they understand what it means and how they can react?
It's always the last mile of any project, right? But it's actually quite difficult as well, though. So every project we work on, every customer we work with, it's, the last part of the project is how do you communicate what we've measured and, what we've done for you. It's really important because it strays into greenwashing, and you've got to be careful that,
Absolutely.
We may take a scientific approach, but a salesman could take that scientific approach and create a story and put it in the market. So that's one aspect of it. But I think consumers, yes. So I'm a little bit older than both of you, and I've got children that are in the early 20s. They actually do care. They do care when they're buying something. Now, but that's not necessarily a direct correlation to carbon. It's about what's the environmental impact of the thing I'm buying, which is, yes, it is carbon, but the average Johnny on the street doesn't really understand CO2e.
No.
But they understand, is this thing I'm buying got a minimal environmental impact? Yes, they do. And the way businesses establish whether that thing has a minimal environmental impact is through carbon measurement. So I think it's just, again, a slightly nuanced, point to discuss that I think most people would care if they had a choice. Buying two things that looked identical and felt identical, if that had a lower environmental impact, they would probably buy it. I think most people would. But how does the people that make that prove it has a lower event, a lower impact? The way you do that is to CO2e. It's quite simple. So
yeah. So if we take it a step back, maybe, Jeff, and talk about what it means internally for your business, because obviously you've got different departments within there and how that data is used to drive decision making. I guess you have a purchasing team, the operations guys, then how you take it and maybe communicate that to the consumer that might be making a purchasing decision. How does it impact the different parts of the business, and how are you using that data rather than just having one report at the end that says, okay, we're doing something about carbon here, but how are you actually using the data to action things internally?
Yep. So it's all about transitioning it from like a dashboard into the operations themselves. And we do that through something that we call a carbon guardrail within our internal parlance, but is really a shadow price on carbon. And so about a year ago, we made the decision that we had reached a level of both data quantity and quality that we would start to be able to put an actual dollar value on this thing that we say that we value. It's these carbon reductions. And we apply that across basically any carbon reduction opportunity that's out there, whether it's scope 1, 2, or 3. And we treat it the same, whether it is like an energy efficiency projects and operations, or on a procurement tender, or an HR team wants to implement a carpool program or something to reduce emissions. And so it just allows us to take it from this relatively abstract, invisible, tasteless gas into something that we actually value as an organization, and allows it to compete against all the other things that are also important to us as an organization: price, quality, et cetera.
Yeah, that's great. Do you see the same, Dom? Is there an area where people focus? We hear a lot about clean energy, right? And starting at different points, but is there a place that is a simple kind of getting your foot on the journey, if you like?
Many customers, that's the question we get asked. Excuse me, where do you start? And that's a really hard one, especially if you're not the biggest business and you haven't got a big budget. Ultimately, the place that any business should start is just measuring scopes 1, 2, and 3, and do that at a minimum once a year. And that's a entry-level way, place to start. The challenge with that is the market's moved, and yes, that is an absolute critical component, but what you have to get to is what's called product carbon footprinting, and then because again, if I go back to that analogy around if I'm Procter & Gamble and I'm buying a pallet of cartons, for example, the scope 1 and 2 doesn't directly correlate to the, that pallet of cartons they've just bought, because, and there are ways of correlating it, but ultimately you need to get to the point where every order has a carbon footprint associated to that. So whether that is displayed during the buying process, during the Cimpress technology stack, or whether it's, displayed during the procurement process if you're a big business, we see lots of that aspect where the big brands are demanding that their supply chain provides carbon footprint at the point of purchase. So again, back to the same analogy again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I'm Procter & Gamble, I'm buying that box of, that pile of cartons. They'll get 3 prices during the procurement process because they need, obviously the price has to be right, but also they get 3 carbon footprints at the same time. So they've adopted exactly the same strategy as Jeff has, that says we're buying on carbon and we're buying on price. And that to me is a momentous step forward in the industry, because you can be the best price and the lowest carbon, okay? And if that's the case, let's talk about that and promote it, because it's not always more expensive. And back to your question, I think that if you've got a big factory and you could put solar on the roof, of course there's a business case to put solar on the roof. But if you haven't got a factory and solar cannot be fitted, or it needs loads of structural work, that may blow the business case out. So it's really horses for courses, depending on what your factory looks like. So it's a really tough one. It's a really tough one. But we see lots of customers asking those questions.
Yeah, and I guess we're all working in an industry that's so diverse, so complex. That's one of the hard things, right? Is where to start and how do you start those conversations? So as a supplier into industry, I know at Sun Chemical we very much have product carbon footprint certifications or reports for every product now that we sell. I would imagine many of our kind of competitors have the same. Maybe some are a little behind. It's how we get the industry as a whole to be in the right place. But then where do you look when you're discussing with your suppliers? What is the impact? Is it the substrate? Is it the ink? Is it the transportation? Is it your factory operational kind of emissions? What's having the biggest impact within the print industry, and how can we each within our little sectors of that have an influence and make the changes?
I mean, so from what we see, substrate is the biggest driver.
I agree.
Both between the option to have 2 different substrates, one having just generally lower emissions than the other material, and then when you have chosen your material, that there's 5 different suppliers, you're going to have 5 different sets of emissions. But definitely being driven by product. I mean, and hazard an educated guess that it's in the 70 to 80% range most of the time, with transportation and then the actual manufacturing process of the print being much smaller percentages.
Yeah, so just go a bit deeper. A paper-based product is probably 60, so we're not far away, 60%. If you move into a polymer-based product, it's a lot higher than carbon footprint. But what's really interesting is that when you look at display material for an event industry, for example, they tend to take longer to produce because of the nature of what they are, and they tend to travel a long way to the final destination. So, for example, if we exhibited in the hall in Dusseldorf, we as a British company would probably produce the display in the UK. I actually take on the Eurostar, by the way, so it's quite straightforward, but a bigger business that had a bigger display would probably ship that a long way. And that's where life cycle carbon footprint's critical.
Yeah.
Because you've got to look at the transport, which can be a significant part of the carbon footprint, especially if it's a heavy product, by the way, to state the absolute obvious here. If it's a heavy product, you're putting on a van or a truck, it's going to be quite high in carbon footprint.
Or a tight timeline.
Exactly.
Increases
there's 100 dynamics going on here. It's just a really complex piece. But that's why life cycle carbon footprinting at a product level allows you to make those decisions on a job by job basis. Because the thing with the printing and packaging sector, I always say this, and I'm almost like stating the obvious, every time we press go on a job, that job is a unique specification. We're not making widgets, right? We're not making a widget and a machine is running all year round, pumping out a widget, because that's easy to measure because it's the same widget every single time.
Yep.
But every time we turn a press on or, a converting line on, that is a unique thing. It has a unique set of raw materials, has a unique set of ink, has a unique way they're packing it. It then gets a unique delivery, and that's the complexity of our marketplace. And ultimately, that's why we focus on the market, A, because we know it, but B, it is really, really complicated because every time you touch a machine, it's a different job.
Yeah, and if I could just dovetail off that, I think that's why you've seen a lot of companies not push forward too hard on putting point of sale carbon footprint on stuff just yet. There are some, but I know that that's not something that Cimpress has really, really pushed hard on just yet. And I think there's sometimes there's accusations in the industry that it's green hushing, and I think it's not. I think it's more a recognition of how high we need to hold the bar in terms of the accuracy of the information that we're giving people. And I think despite the complexity, there is the ability to get to that level of accuracy, but it takes time, it takes effort, it takes investment. And until you've made that time and investment into it, you literally can't do it in a way that will stand up to regulatory scrutiny. But it doesn't mean that companies aren't pushing to get there to be able to do that. But they have to not say anything until they're truly ready to do so.
I agree. It's a very expensive. What Jeff just described, that's what we do. Automated carbon footprinting, right? Bit of data comes in, carbon footprint comes out. I looked this morning before I left, 4.6 million carbon footprints, unique specifications. It just processes every single day, yeah? But the problem is that requires very high quality data.
Yeah.
And it requires some investment. And those two things are not always available in our sector. And that's the challenge, right? You need to have those two things, high quality data, and you need to have the investment power.
So for us, we have the same issue, right? When companies expect us to have the carbon footprint certification of the products, obviously there's a number of components that go into an ink, and how do you trust the data and how far back can you take the data? Because a lot of stuff that arrives to us is already a mixture, and the person that sold us that doesn't necessarily know what went into the mixture. They've kind of taken another person's product, mixed it with theirs to create that mixture. So how far are you able to go back, and how do you work with your supply chain partners to make sure that the data is as accurate and high quality as possible?
How long we got? Because we can spend the next 2 hours talking about that one subject.
Yeah. So we don't have a hard and fast rule about how far we go back. I do think that one of the most important functions that we serve, though, is as the market signal. Because if we give the market signal to Sun Chemical feels more emboldened to go back to their supplier and give that market signal, and so on and so on and so on. And so I think we're going through a transition in the industry where we're pushing for more and more primary data. We know that there's some secondary estimates built into that. Hopefully those estimates get smaller and smaller over time. And we have to be comfortable with the fact that that can cause changes in the carbon footprint. We thought it was this, and now it's this based on certain assumptions, but those changes are actually a good thing. And we need to be very careful that we don't let them get positioned as not a good thing. That's my view on it.
Look, same point really. I think that we take two approaches to it, because if I reverse up to 7 years ago when we started, we contacted all the paper merchants and paper mills and said, look, give us your LCA work, give us your studies, and you can collect that data, and it's quite useful. But what you find is each of those studies are done with different methodologies and different calculations. So actually, even when you go to get primary data and primary studies from your supply chain, you've then got to do a compare and contrast. So we do both. We collect primary data, and then we also model, because what you cannot do is have a very high quality study from Sun, for example, that's a certified study, very high quality, versus one of your competitors that have done a lightweight study. Because if you're making the comparison, they're not like for like comparisons, because yours will be 100% accurate because it's a certified study. Theirs is done on the back of a fag packet. Yeah, and what they should do is overestimate, and their numbers should be higher. But the problem is not everybody does that. So, and it comes back to this problem of budget again, is that, you know, the smaller businesses probably haven't got the budget that some's got, therefore yours is a higher quality. So we ingest both sets of studies, a high quality primary study from a supplier, and we also ingest a model as well, which standardizes a methodology. So we in effect deconstruct your, sorry Simon, you're not gonna like this, we deconstruct your studies, yeah, and we rebuild them for you, because you can then do a like for like, because my customer may buy ink from 4 different suppliers. So when they're making that judgment, they've got to have a like for like comparison.
Yeah, and I guess that goes to the age of the data and how long does data remain valid, right? Because whether we like it or not, most chemicals that we're dealing with touch China or come from China or Asia, at least in some form. And today they're much more, they understand what is required, why we're asking questions. But maybe 10 years ago, there wasn't that level of understanding or recognizing why that data was important. So does that go again to your point about reassessing data over time, because things change, measurement techniques change,
you should repeat annually, by the way. That's the rule as such. If you do a study, you should repeat that study every year, especially if you're looking at LCA, because emission factors get updated every year. Okay, they don't stay static, and things change, right? Things change in factories, things change in transport. So actually what you should do, especially if you're looking at an LCA, which is, you know, the best of the best, by the way, of an ink product or a paper product or a plastic product, that really should be repeated annually. Okay. And we do lots of that repeating. But again, you need the budget. That's the challenge.
And my hope is that capitalism is actually going to be the thing that drives it to be done more frequently, because once you find out as a company that you're being measured, and in some cases your service or your product is being purchased with the carbon data being valued, you start to say, well, one of the ways I can become more competitive is to reduce my carbon footprint. And then if I've reduced it, I have a vested interest in getting my product reassessed again. Right. And it's also a lot easier to justify the investment to do so, because it's contributing to the overall commercials of my company. So I think the more companies that put in place a way to value carbon that makes sense within their organization, not everybody has to do it the way that we've done it, but they're proving that they are valuing it. Some of the more frequent updates, which we then benefit from, happen a little more organically just as a result of their own commercial interest.
No, and I guess it makes sense, because like if you look at what may be coming down the line, like digital product passports and things like that, where there likely is going to be a declaration somewhere of that, it's going to have to be continually measured, right? You can't rely on data from 5 years ago to a product that's produced today, right? So many things have changed in that timeline.
We always laugh at work actually in the office, because, you know, we deal with hundreds of different customers. But when you look at one customer, what they get is they call it Excel blindness. So if you think of a normal, you know, printing company based out of Belgium, they're dealing with, you know, 20 or 30 different brands, because they're printing work for all these customers. Each of those customers just asking them every year they're asking them for information. What's your carbon footprint this year? But they're all asking in slightly different ways. And that's the slight frustration, right? Because there is only one way, and that's governed under Greenhouse Gas Protocol, right? But all of those big brands are asking all of those converters for all of this information. And it must be doing this around the globe, right? It's just goes on day in, day out. But if the brands are asking the printers and the converters every year for the data, that supports my view, right? It has to be a continuous process of repeating the study, measuring it, repeating, measure, repeat, measure. Yeah.
Good. So maybe we can kind of wrap and think about, you mentioned life cycle, and it's interesting to me, and maybe it's a provocative point, but we talk a lot about recyclability, reusing, but when we're talking about substrate, and you mentioned substrate may be one of the highest contributors for your business, at least in trying to understand the carbon footprint, where does the recycling part sit within that versus fresh media versus recycled content versus fully recycled? Are you measuring the energy and the emissions that go into the recycling process and what that means? And I guess that opens a whole can of worms in a way that you start to lose control of, or it's much harder to understand the data pathway.
So, I mean, we've talked a lot about essentially upstream measurement of carbon footprint. There is the whole downstream measurement where, quite frankly, the estimates that you have to make are much larger. I think the piece that we always start with, especially in the print industry, because color is very important, we always start with fit for purpose first, and then try to reduce emissions with a substrate that is fit for purpose, which, for example, nothing drives me more crazy than when somebody buys a substrate that has a useful life inside of 60 years when they're having an event that's going to last a week, right? And so I think that's when I say fit for purpose. And then where we can, there's obviously, not all the time, but generally benefits to adding recycled content and improving recyclability. And so that pushes us. I mean, we can't control ultimately what consumers do with products when we're done with them, but we can definitely design products that are monomaterial and can then therefore pass through recycling streams that are capable of doing so.
Yeah, that's good. And I think, so when you go back to life cycle, the word life cycle, that under the protocol, you actually must include end of life.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens in all likelihood, what happens to that product when you no longer need it? Now that's really complicated, because if you're producing a product that's used globally, every country, every town, every city has a different recycling process.
Absolutely.
So you have to model, you have to apply what's called a model, to get that number right. But ultimately it is a trade-off, because if you look at the fiber market, a sheet that is 100% recycled content has probably got a higher carbon footprint than a virgin sheet. That is fact. Okay. Now that's a trade-off, right? It's got a higher carbon footprint because of the energy used to make that paper from recycled paper. There's all that upstream stuff that Jeff was talking about. It has a higher carbon footprint, but you're not chopping a tree down, which has to be a good thing, right? Now, you could play into the argument they're managed forests. Of course, we're not going to go down that route. But when you talk about plastic product, it may well be the same story, right? That if you're collecting lots of unused or end-of-life plastic, bringing it back to a factory, recycling it, reproducing, new plastic product again, the carbon footprint's probably higher than virgin product, but you're not sucking the oil out of the ground. And it has to be a trade-off. It has to be a trade-off. So product that has recycled content, and certainly a high recycled content, will have a marginally higher carbon footprint, but fundamentally you're not sucking the soul out of the earth, which does sound very tree huggy, I know, but it's really important, right? It's really important we don't take all our natural resources and use them all up. So it has to, sustainability is always a trade-off. It has to be, but you need to take scientific measurement against scientific measurement and make the right judgment.
Okay, that's great. Appreciate your time, guys. Maybe you have one or two final thoughts from the Cimpress experience and where you're going in the future, and anything you wanted to add, Dom, before we close.
Well, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to sit here. It's one of the rare privileges to be in a position where we get to communicate to the industry about some of the work that we're doing, the things that we're learning, and these type of opportunities are great. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, big thanks to me too. But I guess from an industry point of view, I've been in the industry since I was 16, and I'm quite old, like I say, and I'm very passionate about our industry. And I think it's come a long way, but there's so much more, our industry can do. But the challenge is we have SMEs through to very large organizations.
Absolutely.
And there are hundreds of thousands of businesses out there. So I just encourage everybody to measure. That's my final point.
That's great. Well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dominic, for your time. I think we've all learned something, and I think decarbonisation, especially within the print industry, is clearly a very complex topic. But hopefully that conversation's helped debunk a few of the myths and made the situation a lot clearer for everyone. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll catch you soon on another FuturePrint podcast.